Also, his partner in Oregon, Jay Boberg, who is coming to us from the Oregon, or are you in California, Jay?
I'm in Santa Monica.
Beautiful.
Stuck.
And then on mute, but you can see his lovely face in headshot, is Kevin Schlachter, the National Sales Manager for Domain Nicolas-Jay, who is going to be driving the PowerPoint presentation today. But we're having a great group. We really couldn't be happier to do this multi-country, multi-state presentation on both Mayo Camazé and Nicolas-Jay. And with that, I will ask Doug to say some things, and then we'll get right into it.
Ask Scott, how many people are on the call?
We've got 52 attendees.
Great. So it's 52 wine zealots, wine nuts. That makes me very proud that we are able to do things like this. Mm-hmm. So thank you, Jean-Nicolas and Jay. I just wanted to jump in for a minute just to say that it was a great pleasure of both Peter and mine to be over with Jean-Nicolas in February, and we were just chatting a minute ago. So little did we know in February in the cellars, drinking some spectacularly great wines with Jean-Nicolas, that the world would turn upside down for a period of time. But I will say that in my 40 active years in the wine business, Burgundy has always been at the center of my heart of love of wines, and it was my first visit to the cellars of Mayo Camazé. And Jean-Nicolas was quite gracious in terms of spending the time with us, with Peter, myself, and Adrian, actually. And I thank him for that. I hope it was the first of many visits. I hope we didn't do anything to keep us away from the cellars in the future, Jean-Nicolas. But truly, to have this property in our portfolio, and we were quite proud of our portfolio before we purchased Boston Wine Company and therefore the Mayo Camazé brand. But to also expand that with Jay and with the Nicolas-Jay wines, which I find are fabulous wines that I did not know until, again, we were able to start digging into the library of wines that was previous Winebo but now Boston Wine Company. So thank you both. We don't take it for granted when we get luminaries like you on the screen. We'd like to be in person, but this is second best. And I will say from our family, thank you for doing what you do, making the wines you make, telling the stories you tell, owning brilliant vineyards that again in brilliant areas to make the wines you make. And we are wildly proud to be part of your families and representing your wines in our trading area. So welcome and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So just before we get started, as sort of a reminder to everybody, as this is a webinar format, if you should have questions, whether it's throughout the presentation or at the end, you can use the Q&A or the chat feature at the bottom of the screen. Just type the question in, and either Scott or myself will answer it at the end, and be the ones kind of footballing that. So with that, I will turn it over to Jay and to Jean-Nicolas.
Jean-Nicolas?
All right. Let me start.
Well, before you start with the thing, let me just say one thing. If you're not going to do a little deal, to address what Doug said, we're very happy to be with Boston Wine Company. Tony has a long relationship with Jean-Nicolas, and to be honest, that was a lot of what brought us there was his passion for wine. But I also wanted to just add in that even hearing Doug talk about your passion for Burgundy and the wines you've been drinking, and I've now been in the market a few times and worked with some terrific salespeople, and all they wanted to talk about was wines, and not even necessarily the wines we were selling, just wine, period. And this kind of passion and being associated with people who truly are just as crazy about wine as Jean-Nicolas and I are is something that means a lot. And however successful we are, the fact that we're doing it with people that share the same kind of values and passion for wine is something that we really appreciate. And so I thought it was important to say that at the top of this. So at any rate, Jean-Nicolas, take it away.
No, for sure. Absolutely. I subscribe to to the exact same words. Yes, I'm sorry because I'm not always able to come very often. Actually, I have not been to Boston for some time, and it's a pity. I should, I know. But I'm very pleased when people come and see me in in Vendôme, and we opened the cellar, and I was very happy to receive Doug in February, especially considering how complicated it's going to be to travel in the next few weeks and months. Okay, so perhaps I can give you a very brief history and background for Méo Camusé. Jay will do that for Nicolas-Jay. We'll speak about how we, the two of us, came and teamed up. But let me start with the old world and Méo Camusé in Vendôme. This is a family estate, and dating from, I actually don't know. The domain is mostly centered on Vendôme. We have about 18 hectares, and so we have some Vendôme, Clos Vougeot, Nuit Saint-Georges, Corton, mostly Côte de Nuit, with the exception of Corton. And this is basically a family domain that was built by the Camusé family first, and then the Camusé family, having virtually no inheritance, turned to my father, who inherited the domain in 1959. And this is how it became Méo, our family name, Méo Camusé. But yes, we're very proud of this heritage from the Camusé family, because Etienne Camusé, that you can see now on your screen, the gentleman in the black and white photograph, was a figure in Burgundy, a member of parliament for the region for 30 years. Was very devoted to the wine, and was very instrumental in putting up the appellation contrôlée system in France just after World War I. And there was just a reminder last year at the Clos Vougeot, the castle of the Clos Vougeot that you see on the photograph, that he was very instrumental in 1919 in putting up the notion of appellation contrôlée in the Versailles Treaty that ended World War I. So, you know, I didn't even know that at the time, but that's a testimony and of his dedication and what he accomplished during his tenure as a member of parliament. So I've been, my father was not a vintner. Etienne Camusé, because of his political activities, had leased his domain to tenants, and my father kept that arrangement. So I was actually the first in the family for a number of generations to actually come back and be a vintner, and that started in 1989. I was very lucky to learn whatever I know today, and which is arguably not much, because this is a trade where the more you know, the more you understand you know nothing or very little. And but I was happy to learn under Henri Jaillet, who was one of the tenants of the domain and had gone into retirement in 1988. And this is basically it. You know, 30 years later, here I am. I have I've been extremely lucky to start at the time in Burgundy, where it was a turning point. From a moment in the 60s and 70s where, and even the 80s decade, where the quality was slipping. And I came at a moment when there was a reaction from the younger generation, and I participated in this, but that was a movement that was already coming and in force when I arrived. I was very lucky also because I met this guy Jay, just before I came back to the domain. We met in 1988. We say 87, but I think it was 88.
Was it 88?
No. Yeah, it was 88. Yeah. You met me. I think I was drunk and you were high.
Is that true? I was on my way to a gig. It was in Philadelphia.
Yes. So so that was at that moment. Do you want to
Well,
say
you
how?
can tell a little bit. One thing before we go to that thing, I think it's interesting. Oftentimes I don't know if people have the guts to ask you about this kind of stuff, but the whole connection with Jaye, and you say your father was very politically involved, but he was more than politically involved. He was really a big player in the early 60s, but he hired Henri Jaye. I mean, he had the Métayage deal, and maybe you could talk just for a minute about that, because people always want to know about the Jaye wines, which have become legendary, and of course all the fakes and this and that and the other. But the vineyards, some of the vineyards that were on lease to Henri, he was also making the Mayo Camazé wines, and maybe you could explain how that worked and what vineyards he was doing, and maybe how that worked with the wines that he kept versus he didn't, because I think people tend to, at least they ask me a lot about that.
That's true. Actually, so I explain why, because of Etienne Camuzé's political activities. He had stopped being a full-time vintner and hired some workers who were tenants with whom he shared a crop to work his vineyards for him. So there were a few of them. One of them was Henri. Henri was actually hired by Etienne Camuzé in 1944 or 45. And when the vineyards and the domain passed on to my father, one of the, let's say, moral conditions was that he would keep all the tenants. And this is what he did, because my father had already a career in Paris. But yes, Henri was one of the tenants. And today, of course, because of the aura and the myth of Henri, everybody seems to believe that Henri made all the wines at the domain, which is not the case. Every tenant made the wine for which he was responsible. Henri was responsible for Richebourg, Cros-Parentout, Vaune-Brûlé, and Nuit Saint-Georges Premier Cru Murger. And the others were split with the Fourroy, the Tardy, and they made good wine too. And sometimes it's funny. I feel a little sad sometimes for the Tardy or the Fourroy when somebody says, well, you know, why not this at that era, or you know, that Louis Boudot or that Clos Vougeot was fantastic. You really see that Henri made that wine. It's not the case. It's not the case.
So anyways, it's fascinating to hear about that, and those Jaye wines have become, you know, he's become sort
Yes.
of legendary, and it's amazing how the pedestal that he gets put on. But certainly your relatives did a hell of a job in terms of selecting somebody to look after the wines and make some of those Mayo wines, and what a great teacher to have. Back to Philadelphia. So my sister was going to Penn, was the context, and Jean-Nicolas was going to Penn as well. What were you studying?
Economics, energy economics.
The perfect precursor to make wine in Burgundy. The perfect precursor. And I was there. Someone just asked in the chat room what the gig was I was at. I think it was Concrete Blonde, or maybe it was REM. I don't remember. But I had started a record company called IRS Records with a guy named Miles Copeland. You may have heard of him. His brother was the drummer in the Police. And I was a musician and was the concert director at UCLA and booked some of the first Police shows in the West Coast. And Miles asked me to start this label, and thus went my musical career, as it were. And I was in Philly and had reached out to my sister about her coming out to the gig. And she said, why don't you come over for dinner or for a party or whatever? I don't remember being high, as my partner just accused me of being, but it's possible. to say I didn't really smoke. I did smoke pot early on, but then when the IRS became a real business, I decided maybe that wasn't such a good idea. So I did stop. So I think in 1988, I was not smoking pot. But at any rate, that's not really the drug.
I was not drunk.
Who knows? But at any rate, that started a friendship, and we stayed in touch for all the years in between. Whenever I would visit Europe on trips for my music stuff, we sold IRS, and I later ran MCA Universal, and so had a long time with them. And I would visit Jean-Nicolas, and frankly, I tried to visit anytime I did travel, wherever I was in the world. I always tried to finagle a half a day or a day to go into the nearest wine region and meet with producers and taste wines and do whatever. I have an insatiable curiosity about wine and different wines in different regions and so forth. But their friendship continued, and it led to my music career sort of being over in the about 10 years ago or so, 12 years ago. And I wanted to be in wine, but as you all know, not the easiest business to be in, especially from an economic standpoint, tough to make money in it. And I was up in Oregon and talking with Veronique Duran and David Millman, and the idea of making wine in Oregon came up, and eventually the idea of doing it with Jean-Nicolas seemed like a wonderful, to do it with a friend was something that I wanted to do. And I approached him, and like any good friend, his response was maybe, maybe. But he had actually a great sense in his reaction. His response was, look, I'm making Mayo Camazé. If I'm gonna make wine in Oregon, it has to be at least in the discussion of the best wines of Oregon. I have to at least feel like have the access to the fruit and the vineyards and the capabilities to really compete at that level. And we need to do research. We need to make sure that we can do it. And so we embarked for a couple of years. He made many, many trips to Oregon, and we tasted fruit from well more than we keep saying 200 different vineyard sites, but it was actually more than 200 in the end. We visited all these different cellars. And that is from that research, we then ended up discovering the vineyards that now make up the 8 vineyards that go in our Willamette Valley. And that's really how it all began. He and I own it. We have a few friends. He invited a few of his French friends. I invited a few of my American friends that are sort of passive investors. But for the most part, we own the vast majority, and it's ours to make thrive or not, as the case may be. We're doing our very best.
Good, yeah. So perhaps we should move, to Oregon versus
Well, yeah, let's talk about talk about the making of wine in Burgundy, and then maybe we can talk about the differences in Oregon and what you're seeing. And we've got the information on each of the vintages here, which you can refer to and just talk about the differences in very different places.
Yes, so this is very interesting, because you see that the first years, 2014, the year we started was very close. The 2 first years were very close in terms of harvest dates. Actually, in general, as you can see from the other dates, with the exception of 2016, in general, Oregon is a little later than Burgundy is. It is, I guess the season is generally starting a bit later, because it rains in Oregon quite a lot until April, May. And the weather is a bit milder here in Burgundy at that moment, or a little bit more sunny, let's say. But in terms of climate, the rains are much more different in Oregon, because it rains, as I said, until May, and then it stops raining. Summer is extremely dry, and until it resumes raining at the end of September. And this is really the challenge.
Sometimes before that.
Yes, but you do not want to harvest after the rains have settled in Oregon, because you never know when it stops. But generally, you're good. You're okay, provided you watch it. Rain in Burgundy is much more evenly spread over summer. The problem is that it rains violently, with a lot of thunderstorms, and June being the most dangerous month in Burgundy. In terms of climate, I would say that Oregon tends perhaps to be a bit warmer, although the last 3 vintages in Burgundy have been very warm. So that's perhaps not valid anymore. And in terms of also the style of the wine, maybe we'll talk about that a bit later on. But Oregon wines tend to be a bit sweeter, having a sweet touch, a texture which is a bit more silky and having sweet notes, compared to Burgundy, which has more acidity and is a bit more structured and a bit more upright and lean in terms of the character. So that would be the biggest difference between the two regions. And maybe also I can explain how it works in terms of since the harvests are so close to one another. I stay in Burgundy. We have an associate winemaker who is Tracy Kendall, and she's doing a great job. And I stay in touch with these folks very regularly and every day during harvest. And I join Oregon and stay in Oregon when harvest is finished in Burgundy. I'm generally able.
Sorry, I want to interrupt you for a second. You guys will find this really hard to believe, but Burgundy takes preference over Oregon. It's a shame, but at the end of the day, until that Richebourg is totally looked after, we can't get him to come over to Oregon. But it just sort of depends. What he's saying is that Jean-Nicolas, you participate in every day, every decision, everything that we're doing. Tracy and I get on a Skype with you at noon every day, 9 o'clock Paris or French time, which sometimes you're in not the best mood, depending on what happened that day. But it is 9 o'clock, and we go through you have all the data from that particular thing, whether it's in terms of the sampling that we've done or what's going on in the tank. So you have all the data, and Tracy and I basically go through all of that with you. But as soon as we can get him out of Burgundy, he comes over, you come over, and then you're in Oregon there for the rest of the harvest. And I guess for the most part, you've been coming more after. There was one vintage that you actually came before. Where Burgundy,
2016, yes.
Yeah, 2016.
Yes.
But as you can tell, the level of hands-on involvement by those pictures and so forth, I mean, it's the entire winemaking team and harvest team, and Nicolas-Jay is not a huge organization. I mean, it's Jean-Nicolas, myself, Tracy. We have Jonathan, who does our tasting room, which is in our house. It's not like a tasting room. It's basically at our house. You come sit at our dining room table, and Jonathan tastes with you. We did eventually hire an accountant, so I'm no longer doing QuickBooks, which is really good news for everybody involved. And then we hired Kevin just recently in terms of sales. So you can imagine the degree of hands-on in terms of what we're doing. So I just thought it's important to point that part out. But yes, winemaking that we're doing and what we're following is basically the same as what you're doing in Burgundy.
Yes, it is. I wanted to answer a question which has not been asked, but we get very often, of course, seeing these dates of harvest so close. How can you manage both? And of course, the first element of answer was already what Jay explained. I must say that obviously it's a drawback to have the harvest happening at the same time, but it's also an advantage in the meaning that I'm totally focused on harvest. You know, I imagine myself, if I was doing some wine in New Zealand, putting myself on harvest mode in March would be difficult. And most of the time, I'm able to say, well, this is the difficulties or this is the challenges that we have in Burgundy this year. Beware of this. And incredibly, we've had some vintages which were very much alike on both sides of the Atlantic, and especially the vintage that you're now receiving in Boston, 17 vintage. I think it's fascinating to see and to taste side by side, because it's the same kind of vintage in Oregon and Burgundy, same character. So maybe we can go a little bit into this. Perhaps you want Jay to say something else about Nicolas-Jay. We haven't really. We should perhaps present Bishop Creek and what.
Well, we started in 2004. Some of you just started, well, actually all of you just started selling our wine. So you probably don't know. We started in 14 was our first vintage. And the primary wine that we have made was the Willamette Valley. The Willamette Valley is the result of those 8 vineyards that we selected that we mentioned in those trips, the due diligence, as Jean-Nicolas referred to it. And those vineyards, the Bishop Creek is the vineyard that we purchased. And it's interesting, I think, the story of us purchasing it in the sense that oftentimes you purchase things because someone brings it to you and you discover it because it's simply for sale. That's not how we discovered Bishop Creek. We discovered Bishop Creek going in one of these cellars, like we were doing, every trip. We would visit 3 cellars a day, and we'd do it for 5-6 days in a row. So we'd be in, 10, 15 cellars in a week during one of Jean-Nicolas' visits. And each, as you may know, in Oregon, most wineries, whether even the old ones like Adelsheim or Ponzi or whatever, they may own 3 or 4 vineyards, but they still buy fruit from various different other vineyards. And there are many wineries that might buy fruit from as many as a dozen different vineyards. So when you go into someone's cellar, you actually get the opportunity to taste an awful lot of different wines from different locations. And the way we discovered Bishop Creek was simply going into someone's cellar. And neither of us had actually heard of Bishop Creek. We didn't realize at the time that was where Jason Lett had launched his Black Cap label before he rejoined the family business at Irie, and he had managed that vineyard and been involved with it for, I guess, close to 10 years. But we didn't know anything about it, and we tasted it, and we came out as we did all those tastings with our notes and sort of talked through, sat in the car and said, well, what do you think? And we both said, boy, that Bishop Creek was interesting. It was sort of exotic and had a lot of girth, and it had a lot of the things that Jean-Nicolas and I both appreciate in a wine, in the sense of balance and elegance. It was not just powerful, but it also had the acidity and the structure to be able to stand up to that, to the length. Yeah, exactly. So anyways, we ended up, not ironically, we approached them about buying some fruit and getting a section of that vineyard. It was one of the only vineyards that we were told, no, sorry, there's none available. It's like, okay. And I don't know if it was, I can't remember now if it was 3 weeks or 3 months, but some period later, we learned that it was for sale. And so I called up Jean-Nicolas in one of the great moments so far in our little history and said, I just got a phone call. This vineyard's up for sale. I told the guy, we're not buying a vineyard. We want to work with different vineyards. And Jean-Nicolas says, you know why we made a plan? And I said, why is that? He says, so we could change it. I think we should buy this vineyard. And I said, you know what? I think you're right. So we mustered up the money and we ended up buying Bishop Creek. Which turned out to be very, very fortunate.
Yes, it's what we loved about that vineyard is because we learned afterwards that that vineyard had been on sale for for almost a year. And what we loved about it is what was difficult for the others. That is the slope, as you can see, the fact that it's high density and almost 5,000 vines per hectare. In Burgundy, we're at 10,000 vines per hectare. So we really believe in tight density. And it had been well farmed, and the fact that it was on its own roots also. So we loved everything, and that was some of the factors that were thought to be a little difficult, and the fact also that it was planted in 1988. And probably people saying, well, 1988, that's a bit old. I said, well, that's young, but that's beginning to be interesting. And so we immediately fell in love with that vineyard. And
it's
yes,
interesting. The other vintners we talked to about, I know Bishop Creek. Yeah, it's been around a long time. Really hard to farm. It's really steep. You need to have special equipment because the rows are too narrow. It's really a pain. I mean, the fruit's great, but I mean, God, it's very difficult. And basically every aspect that everybody complained about were all the things that Jean-Nicolas loved about it. But ultimately, I think going back to the original point is that we didn't discover it because it was for sale. We discovered it because we loved the wine and then found out that it was for sale. So it's turned out to be, if we look back, like I say, one of the great things for us is owning that vineyard. The other 7 vineyards, going back to that map, if you can show everybody, that we source fruit from, is just going through from the top. You have the Bishop Creek, which is organically farmed, and as Jean-Nicolas mentioned, 1988 is when the bulk of the Pinot own-rooted was planted. We have since planted some Chardonnay and grafted over some Pinot Gris, but we'll get to that in a minute. We also have the Knight's Gambit vineyard in the Dundee Hills. We have the Nisa vineyard in the Dundee Hills. We have La Colina in Dundee Hills, all of those on the Jory soil, the volcanic soil. And then coming down to the McMinnville AVA, we have the Momtazi vineyard, which I'm sure many of you heard. There's several, St. Innocent and Kelly Fox and Chapter 24, a bunch of different vineyards sourced from Momtazi. That's a biodynamically farmed vineyard. And then the Highland vineyard just below that, which is actually quite close on the same road as Momtazi. That's one of the oldest vineyards in Oregon, planted in 1976 on the Corey clone. That as well is own-rooted. And then moving over to Eola Amity, we have the Hopewell vineyard. And Hopewell is the youngest vineyard that we have. That's just over 10 years old now, almost 11. But we fell in love with that. Yes, we did the fruit, but it was really about Mimi Castile. And some of you may know Mimi Castile. She's part of the Bethel Heights family, and this has now become her project and her vineyard. And she's quite a knowledgeable farmer. And there's a fantastic podcast that I'll drink to that. I'm sure many of you probably listen to Levy Dalton's podcast, I'll drink to that. But she does one on farming and biodynamically and organically and so forth that is really fantastic. But she's a pistol, and that's a great vineyard. We love that vineyard. The other half of our block at Hopewell goes into Lingua Franca's single vineyard called Mimi's Dream. And that's, of course, a reference to Mimi Castile. So half that block goes into our Willamette Valley and the other half. So it kind of gives you an idea of the quality of the grapes that we're talking about that are going into Willamette Valley. And then the last vineyard being Temperance Hill, which is, again, one of the older vineyards. Many people, Bergstrom, Lavinia, a bunch of folks source fruit from there. We've got a fantastic block there. And those are the 8 vineyards that make up the Willamette Valley. And this is where Jean-Nicolas gets to blend, something that keeps it interesting, because there's just not a lot of blending being done in Burgundy.
Yeah, that was a very interesting step because of course in Oregon, as you mentioned, Jay, many people are are buying from many spots and doing some single vineyards more and more, but doing a kind of signature wine, and this is what we wanted to do too, to establish a brand style and establish a kind of consistency. And we also wanted to show the character of the region and to realize a kind of synthesis of the region and of the Willamette Valley, and really show what's a very good representative of the valley. So this was why that was the initial decision to do a blend. And doing a blend is really interesting. It's really a work of art, and it's fascinating to see how, you know, you bring in a small amount and you think that this is going to have bring the touch that you wanted to bring, and no, actually it's everything is crumbling. All the elements don't fit together anymore. So you thought it was a good idea. It's not a good idea, but it's anyway. It's fascinating procedure.
I mean, we spend 6 months basically on different blends. I mean, Jean-Nicolas on various different trips to Oregon. And like you say, I mean, you know, a little bit here and there, and you're surprised. But Tracy will put together based on the previous vintages, and we start, and then you'll add or take away, and then you come back, and like you said, that sense of surprise. Sometimes the things you think, I don't know that'll ever work, and it's like, wow, that really made all the difference in the world. But we basically do 3 different blending sessions where we sort of narrow it down. But the wines are not blended until just before bottling, right? I mean, they're all vinified separately. If you go into our cellar now, you'll find all of the different blocks at Highland, at Bishop Creek. They're all in their own barrels currently. We thief the wine out to do the blending, but then the ultimate blending is usually what, Jean-Nicolas, like 4 weeks before bottling, maybe 5 weeks.
Yes.
Like that.
Yes. Now, what is fascinating is that, you know, it's in a way the contradiction with Burgundy is only apparent, because it's when you go into that process of blending, you of course have tasted all of your wines individually before, and at some point you say, well, really, this is a great wine. You know, Bishop Creek is a great wine. I love it, and it might not be as balanced as your ending wine, the result of you blending, but it has a lot of character. And in a way, you say, well, you know, I'd like to show that, and I'd be fascinating to see how it does evolve over time. So we're going to save a little bit of it. And this is how you reintroduce the terroir. This is how you reintroduce the personality of each vineyard, because in that process of blending, you say, well, you know, this is going to be to bring something absolutely great to the final blend. But at the same time, you love the personality of that wine, and you say, well, I want to see how it develops over time. And this is how we came to select a few single vineyards that we're doing, and the most prominent being Bishop Creek. And I must say that I was really impressed with the personality of various vineyards in Oregon. I was not expecting such a diversity and also such a quality in the personality of the vineyards. And thinking that these vineyards are still quite young, it's extremely promising for the future, I think.
Jean-Nicolas and Jay, probably both of you, could you speak a little bit about, you mentioned own-rooted, and could you speak a little bit about the phylloxera, both as it relates to Burgundy and as well how you managed to come across this own-rooted, and why you chose or choosing to keep it the way it is instead of crafting over? You know, what makes own-rooted special?
Yeah, it's of course coming from Europe, where you have no unrooted vineyards. Everything is grafted over because phylloxera destroyed everything. It's fascinating to see that there are still a few vineyards which are on their own routes in Oregon, and Bishop Creek being one of them. And of course, when we purchased it in 2014, we made sure that there was no phylloxera. And to this day, there are none. So it's fascinating because this is something that is, so to speak, is testimony of the past, and we're using these vines which are grafted, so it's American roots with the French plant over, but of course you cannot prevent from wondering what it would be if you had only the French vineyards on their own roots. So we were, when we realized that in our purchase there were a few of these vineyards like this, and that these vineyards were very interesting, had a very nice personality. Is it because of their own roots? Is it because they're a bit old? Because of course, these are the original vineyards that were planted that way in Oregon. Today, there is phylloxera in Oregon, so these vineyards are slowly going. We try to preserve them, and at Bishop Creek, it's been preserved because the vineyard is very isolated. But eventually, it's safe. It's unfortunately safe to say that they will go. So is it? So a number of these vineyards are really interesting, have a great character. So is it because of the own roots, or is it because of the age of the vineyards? We don't know. But we thought it would be really interesting to show them, to put them together, to realize a blend that would work, and put them together and show it to the market, because this is something we love each of these wines. We love the idea, and bring it to the market and see how people love it. And so far, people love it.
Yeah, and it's unique, right? There's 3 vineyards that we're talking about. 3 of our 8 vineyards that go in the Willamette Valley, the Highland Vineyard, the Nisa Vineyard, and Bishop Creek, are all own-rooted or on their own roots. Nisa does have phylloxera. Highland does not appear to have phylloxera, at least that's on a Corey clone, again, planted in '76. But the idea was that it's just completely unique, that who's doing that, right? And to have these 3 fantastic vineyards. And I think it's one of these interesting situations where we were almost caught off guard by how good the wine turned out to be. I mean, they're all wonderful individually. And obviously, these 3 wines make up about between 53 and 57, 58% of the Willamette Valley anyway. But we decided it'd be interesting to do something that was just own-rooted. And I know many of you have tasted the own-rooted because we launched that there in Boston, in Massachusetts. And I've been out with some of you guys, and we've tasted it with you. And this wine tastes fabulous. And the reaction has been really even more than we thought. This just as an idea, I can't remember. I think I had this idea, and we sort of kicked it around, and we sort of fell in love with it. Let's try it. And then we blended it together, and we all, Tracy and John Nicola and I, kind of looked at it, wow, this is good. But the reaction in the marketplace, and actually watching the sommeliers and watching the buyers taste it and react to it, has been really great to see. And we are going to we have obviously limitations, but we're going to try to make a little bit more as the years go by while we can, in order to have a little bit more allocations for you guys on that. We only made, where is own-rooted on here? Yeah, 165 cases. It's not exactly a lot, but I think we sold everything we had, right, when we were there, almost.
Yeah, it's pretty much.
It was pretty much gone.
May I ask, what does your approach to winemaking change, whether it's because it's own-rooted or because it's a different vineyard block or a different vineyard site? And this is a question that could be for both in Burgundy or in Oregon.
Yeah, no, it's does not really change. Let's say that these 3 vineyards share a common characteristic. They're quite early. And it might be something that is due to the own-rooted factor. So, you know, it's one common characteristic. So they're not farmed or they're not vinified in a special manner. You need to adapt to the character of each vineyard, and that character is such that they're harvested relatively early.
Question on oak treatment from the group: is it consistent every year? Do you have uses depending on the vintage and what earth gives you? Do you make a different treatment on oak?
No, in both regions, both in Burgundy and Oregon, I tend to use the same kind of oak every year. I've had and we use less oak in Oregon than in Burgundy. As you know, Mayo Cabernet in Burgundy is quite known for the amount of new oak. But we have about 30% new oak in Oregon, 50% on the single vineyards. But we're quite happy with the 30% new oak. And I tend not to make too many assumptions about the vintage. Because the assumptions are can be so wrong early on. So I think that what goes better is to really fine-tune the oak with the character of the wine. This is what I'm doing in Burgundy. You know, we use certain types of oak for certain appellation, for certain wine. That seems to work well, and this is what we also do in Oregon with the same kind of oak. I'm able to order the same kind of barrels from the cooperage in Burgundy, and we use approximately the same amount every year, because I see this is what works best. And if you say, well, you know, for example, in 2017, well, this is a vintage which is a little less perhaps concentrated. Let's decrease the amount of oak. Maybe it's a good decision. Maybe it's not a good decision, because oak and new oak helps really open the wine, blossom the wine, expand the wine, and maybe this is exactly what this kind of vintage needs, to be expanded. And I've seen that, in really tight and concentrated vintages, I thought that the oak did not integrate very well. I have a few examples in my mind, and surprisingly, and it's not a lack of concentration. And in some other instances, really with lighter vintages, the oak really helped. So it's really difficult to make too many assumptions very early on.
There's a question here about flavor profile. In other words, what were we looking to do, and what kind of wine? And we get asked that a lot. I get asked that, you're partnered with Jean-Nicolas Mayo, what sort of wine? Does he listen to what you have to say at all? Of course, the answer is on occasion. But the kind of wine we're trying to make is based upon what we've been drinking together. The great benefit of being friends for 30 some odd years, and pretty much every time we were together, we were drinking wine, whether he was in California or in America, and I got to be his +1 at various wine dinners, which was a very good place to be, or being in Burgundy or meeting up in Paris. We always were drinking wine, and we like the same things, thank God. The kind of style of wines, if you think about the other Burgundy producers or people with a couple exceptions, I'm a big Chenin Blanc fan. He's not. I like Cornas. He doesn't. But he likes Jura. I don't. But other than that, we do share stylistically.
We agree on Pinot. That's principle. We agree on Pinot. Yeah, that's the.
Anyways, but we do like the same kind of wines, and I think, and Jean-Nicolas, I know you'll jump in here, but we're trying to make wines that primarily have balance. We both love Pinot Noir that has that elegance, that has that perfume, that sort of ethereal perfume that comes out of the glass. You open the bottle, you pour it in, you go, okay, here we go. And that is a mix, not just of ripeness, which is where I think a lot of Pinot Noir, in my own personal opinion, is way too ripe in terms of the way that it's made. That it doesn't have the structure or the acidity to sort of balance that and create that tension between the two. And I think because we agree on exactly what we're looking for in a wine, what is fantastic is we can answer the question by saying, what kind of wine are you trying to make? Wine we want to drink. And that really, when you're actually selling something that you totally believe in, that is actually wine you authentically want to drink every night, it's kind of like, for me, when people ask me how I signed bands, I signed bands that I loved, that I thought were great, and the bands that I really wanted to turn all my friends onto. And thank God there was enough people out there that agreed with, not all the time incidentally, but a lot of times agreed with the bands that I wanted to sign. They thought they were good too, and there it went, and then word of mouth. And that's exactly what I think we're trying to do with Nicolas-Jay, is find like-minded people that feel like these wines are special, and having people like yourselves that help us spread that word. And then they then tell their friends, and they tell their wine store manager, and blah, 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 blah. I think you would agree with all that, Jean-Nicolas. Or hopefully.
Absolutely.
Jay, a question for you. If Jean-Nicolas were a band, who would he be?
Who would he be? You mean bands that I was involved with? Well, I think, listen, Jean-Nicolas, and he's the humblest guy that I know, and is way more open to input, new ideas that Tracy and I throw at him all the time than any person of his level of success. So he's a rock star. But I think, having known him when he wasn't a rock star and seen how thoughtful he is, I would have to say he would be, what band would he be? Jesus, that's a tough question. I don't know, because there's going to be consequences. I'm going to hear about this.
All right, well, if it makes you feel better, I'll ask Jean-Nicolas. Okay, let's say if Nicolas-Jay were a band, Jean-Nicolas, what would the band be? The winery, the vineyards.
I think we have I think we have a great complicity, and so, Jay, what do you think? A band with that is not about to split up, and that is not about to really is acting naturally, and it's not feeding the tabloids with stories of bickering and.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, it's the winery, I suppose, is somewhat arty yet commercial at the end of the day. So I guess it could be, I don't know. In my life, I guess it would be more like REM or maybe the Roots would be a good example in terms of very solid, familial, great musicians, solid with one another and so forth. I don't think we're certainly not Radiohead or something like that. It's a little bit more theater or Sigur Rós, but Nicola doesn't really like the music that I was involved in too much. I mean, he would occasionally come up to Paris and see the bands, but for the most part, he was not a big fan of the bands that I was. He liked the Police. I didn't sign the Police, but my partner was. I got to see them.
Yeah.
He did like the Police.
You have to introduce me to Sting.
So we're up against about an hour. I have one other question for you, and then I'll see if anything come in while you're answering this one. So Jean-Nicolas, you've been making wine for roughly 40 years in France and 6 or so in Oregon, and Jay, same for you. Has there, other than the Bishop Creek and the surprise there, have there been any other great surprises that you've come across in your 40 plus years of doing this?
Yes, I think that there are other sites, Nisa and Montazi, which are great wines, great character. The diversity of character is incredible, between the very soft wine, the structured wine, the wines which are a bit leaner and a bit more upright and slightly more severe, but with a great length. What is so I'm really been excited to see that and to be it's replicable every year. So it's really an acquired character. What is very exciting is the new project that you're seeing on your screen right now, the construction of our winery and facility at property we call Dudley, that will eventually become the Nicolas-Jay property back in the Dundee Hills. And what is extremely exciting currently is Chardonnay. We're releasing our first, let's say, commercial Chardonnay in 18, and we're seeing something that is very, very, very promising. Chardonnay has a long history in Oregon, but it's coming. It's really coming of age, we're very excited with these first two offerings, because I think that we have wines which are very balanced, very fruity, very very elegant, it's difficult to characterize these wines against Burgundy. I think it has a kind of relatively lush character, certainly not California Chardonnay, but it has a charm which is really extremely promising. So I'm extremely excited, as many vintners in Oregon are about Chardonnay. I think it's the next big story in the region.
The new winery is going to be, as you know, we waited a long time, and we've been making wine since 14. We were making the wine at Adelsheim for a few years, and then we've been making it most recently at Sokol Blosser. And they were great hosts and great landlords. We rented sections of their cellar, if you will, to make our wine. But having our own place is really going to make a difference. I mean, just in terms of access and timing and no compromising in terms of any sort of aspect, we can control the environment totally. And it's modest. I mean, what you're looking at is a barn that was there. And so that structure, the outline of that structure was as is. And so we're sort of renovating the inside of it, as you can tell, for the barrel room and the production area. And then that upstairs area that you can kind of see in the middle of the structure is going to be the tasting room. And there's going to be a deck kind of coming off the side of that. And it's stuck back in it's on the north side of the Dundee Hills. And you kind of go up this road. It's got easy access from the main areas. Kind of people that are on their way to Bergstrom or Adelsheim or that area will be able to make a left and then head up into the hills. And we're at the end of that road in this little bowl. And the land there is a really wonderful Joré soil. We've got it's a 50-acre piece of property, 52-acre, and there's about 25 acres that we can plant. And so we're going to plant the first section next year. And then Jean-Nic working on some cuttings, a nursery project that he has coming out of France that will be a second planting, which will probably be 3-4 years down the road, given all the hoops you got to jump through to do that in terms of getting the cuttings coming over. So that's going to be an exciting part of our future. Not so excited about the timing in terms of what's going on right now. You're halfway through building a winery and you go into a pandemic, but it is what it is. We didn't have any control over that, and it's a long-term run here in the wine business. So I'm sure it's going to all end up being fine, and we look forward to hosting all of you out there.
That's great. So we're up against an hour. I want to thank you both again for this tremendous opportunity. And Jay, I don't think it went unnoticed that you have a Cisco Brewer shirt on. So I appreciate the hometown play there. So thank you for that. There was one other question about Oregon Chardonnay. So if people have to jump off, we certainly understand. But as far as how you started to make Chardonnay, did you have any influences? Did you taste a bunch and like it, or did you have Chardonnay and you decided to make it?
We didn't have Chardonnay. We had Pinot Gris, and the Pinot Gris was really nice. But we also tasted some Chardonnay from people in the valley, and obviously I love Chardonnay. Also at home, you may receive some in Boston, not only my Clos Saint-Philibert, but you've seen that I'm playing. This is how I say I'm playing with other appellation and wines in Burgundy, because being so close to these great vineyards, I cannot help trying to find out a little bit of Meursault, a little bit of Corton Charlemagne. So I was really interested and excited about Chardonnay in general, and when we talked about that, the fact that we had perhaps a little too much of Pinot Gris at Bishop Creek, and really made sense of trying to transform it into Chardonnay. So we did plant a little bit, a few acres, but we also converted some Pinot Gris vines to Chardonnay. So we'll have a Chardonnay that actually is made from a good 20-year-old vines, and also some younger vineyards in the years to come. But we have a Bishop Creek Chardonnay that is for Oregon, made out of relatively old vines, and this is a very, very interesting wine, a wine I love, and I hope you will be able to discover it in the year.
All right. Well, with that, again, thank you very much for both your time, and I hope to see you in person very soon. We look forward to drinking these wines and continuing selling them across Boston as much as we can get. We're going to sell for sure.
Great. Bye-bye.
Thanks for all of your efforts.
Thank you. Thanks, Kevin.
Stay safe.